Welcome, everybody, to this Canadian Patriot podcast, where I'm super pleased. I'm honored to be joined by two close friends and collaborators, Sam Labrier and Anton Chaikin, who together, we've all been on this journey of discovery into unveiling, and that involves peeling back a lot of false narratives, but unveiling a truer history of what brought us here as a collective, as a species, as North Americans. And Anton is somebody who I've been following. I've been really trying to immersing myself in his discoveries of historical research since his original book was published, Treason in America, back in I think 1986 or 87. I got a 1991 or 92 edition on my bookshelf, and it's been gold, better than gold. And Anton's recent two books, Who We Are, America is the light is falling on it badly, but Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy. This is volume 2, has recently come out. The links are going to be in the description box for volume 1 and volume 2. High value. Sam has an incredible Substack. His research on the American system, the real American system, is impeccable. He's given many presentations to the Rising Tide Foundation. And today, Anton gave me a call a few days back, and we just chatted a little bit about the misuse of certain terms like the American system, the name of McKinley, which means a lot, but very few people understand what McKinley was, what he did, what current of history and sets of ideas he situated himself voluntarily within, and how he understood the nature of the enemy. And very few people today properly have a grasp of the contours of the fact that we live under an oligarchy, first of all, and that oligarchy has expressed its power in the form more in recent history, the last 500-600 years, especially since the 1688 takeover, the Dutch takeover of England and the establishment of the Bank of England as the British Empire. So very few people understand that. They thus don't understand properly what the American Revolution was about. They can't understand what every single great American president who died while in office was trying to fight against. And they certainly don't understand McKinley. So McKinley's name, like I said, has been used and abused to justify some very bad things, bad economic and military practices. There's been a sort of revival of jingoism. And when you look at the real McKinley, there's a much more sublime story that is lost in the mix. McKinley was not an imperialist, as Sam has proven so eloquently in many of his researches, as has Anton. So today, both guys, I've just invited both to come on to both share their discoveries. We're going to do it a little bit more of a formal presentation setting before having a more organic dialogue. Sam has prepared some slides, some images for about 30 minutes. Anton's prepared a few thoughts, and then we'll just open up and I'll ask questions to both of these guys about the virtues of McKinley, the American system, where it's specifically lacking in the current configuration of how it's being represented today under the figure of Donald Trump and company. So thank you both for doing this. Sam, I'm going to toss the ball in your court to just go through whatever you think we should know based upon your work.
Okay. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, Anton, for doing this. So I recently wrote a piece on William McKinley. And sorry, just share my screen and we'll get going.
And by the way, Sam, your 3-part essay and your associated gigantic, beautiful lecture that you gave on this topic is going to be in the description box under this video when we put it up publicly as well. So for people watching, go to the description box and dig in even more deeply into what, Sam's going to go through.
Okay. Hide this. All right. So I wrote this article called The Strange Fate of William McKinley. And the reason for me getting started on it was seeing this exchange between Max Blumenthal and Judge Andrew Napolitano on his show. And the reason I was watching it is because I often watch Max Blumenthal on the show And in general, I am a fan of a lot of his work. And that was one of the reasons I think that his comments so disappointed me. So I'm going to play this. This is just over 1 minute long, just so everybody can hear what I'm talking about.
But the most schizophrenic part was Trump's pledge to be a peacemaker, when at the same time he invoked the legacy of William McKinley as his lodestar, the lodestar of his foreign policy. William McKinley was one of the worst American presidents in history, next to some of the presidents who were seated beside Donald Trump. He was a fanatically imperialist president. I would have loved to have heard Trump invoke the legacy of William Jennings Bryan, his opponent, who was a silver-tongued populist and anti-imperialist. But Trump chose McKinley, who sought to colonize the Western Hemisphere along the lines of a kind of Monroeist vision, the same vision that John Bolton embraced during the first Trump administration. And another dark aspect is that William McKinley was popped in the head by an anarchist assassin because he was such a tool of big business, such a union buster, and such an imperialist. And Trump invoked McKinley to pledge to basically take over Greenland, threatened war with Panama to take the Panama Canal, and threatened Mexico. And there's always been this kind of invasion of Mexico on the table.
He just said what I didn't think Blumenthal, who I also respect, I didn't think he could possibly go the distance of actually praising McKinley's assassin.
Let him go. Let Sam tell this story.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just had to. But yeah, Sam, go ahead.
No, I feel exactly the same way. There's so many errors in what he said. It's hard to know where to start. Like John Bolton is like the Monroe Doctrine. Like just and I sympathize a little bit because I think that a lot of where he's coming from is influenced by Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn and people like that. I know they had a big influence on him. And Noam Chomsky had a big influence on me when I was like 19, 20 years old.
Sam, please cut to the work that you just did.
Absolutely.
What you just did overturns the whole damn lie. So get into it.
So now. let's get into it. Okay, I appreciate the urgency. Okay, so let's go through the actual record of William McKinley. So in the opening lines of my article, I say that from his first day in office to his last day in office, McKinley never stopped believing that the best American traditions were peace and commerce with all nations. And so let's see from his first day to his last day. So he said, it's been the policy of the United States since the foundation of the government to cultivate relations of peace and amity with all the nations of the world, and this accords with my conception of our duty now. We have cherished the policy of non-interference with affairs of foreign governments wisely inaugurated by Washington, keeping ourselves free from entanglement, either as allies or foes, content to leave undisturbed with them the settlement of their own domestic concerns. It will be our aim to pursue a firm and dignified foreign policy, which shall be just, impartial, ever watchful of our national honor, and always insisting upon the enforcement of the lawful rights of American citizens everywhere. Our diplomacy should seek nothing more and accept nothing less than is due us. We want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression. War should never be entered upon until every agency of peace has failed. Peace is preferable to war in almost every contingency. Arbitration is the true method of settlement of international as well as local or individual differences. It has been recognized as the leading feature of our foreign policy throughout our entire national history. The adjustment of difficulties by judicial methods rather than force of arms. It presents to the world the glorious example of reason and peace, not passion, and War. So that was the first, his inaugural address. You can hear the fanatically imperialist overtones in his pleas for peace. And up until his last day in office, from his last speech, gentlemen, let us ever remember that our interest is in concord, not conflict, and that our real eminence rests in the victories of peace, not those of war. We hope that all who are represented here may be moved to higher and nobler effort for their own and the world's good, and that out of this city may come not only greater commerce and trade for us all, but more essential than these, relations of mutual respect, confidence, and friendship, which will deepen and endure. Our earnest prayer is that God will graciously vouchsafe prosperity, happiness, and peace to all our neighbors, and like blessings to all the peoples and powers of earth. So, I mean, I could just leave it there, but there's a lot more to get into. You know, a lot of the criticisms about William McKinley are that much of what became the modern American empire began under McKinley's administration. But I would argue, much like when the CIA was caught involved in trying to overthrow the government of Charles de Gaulle in France, and JFK having to admit to de Gaulle that he wasn't in control of the CIA and actually pleaded for help in rooting out those responsible because he was not in control. The same is true of McKinley. It's true that, you know, the Spanish-American War began the modern American tradition of military adventurism, occupation, illegitimate territorial expansion. But I hope to show that this was due to other actual fanatical imperialists who were actively working to subvert McKinley's stated wishes and policies. I think that what can be argued about McKinley is that some of his choices for his cabinet and the people he surrounded himself with were not ideal. That criticism of McKinley I could accept. But McKinley himself represented one of the last of the adherents to the best traditions of the American Republic, like isolationism, scientific progress, which antecedents like Abraham Lincoln and John Quincy Adams also advocated for. There is a direct line from John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay through Lincoln and Henry Carey to McKinley himself. It's a direct straight line. McKinley believed, just like Adams did, that America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She's the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She's the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will recommend the general cause by the countenance of her voice and the benign sympathy of her example. And McKinley, as I said, from John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay through Lincoln, he's one of the best examples in American history of using tariffs and other instruments of protectionism to grow the domestic industrial base and stimulate economic growth. And so much so that even in 1900, with the war in the Philippines lingering, he was easily reelected on the strength of the economy. So as he came in, he was punted this foreign policy football on Hawaii from Grover Cleveland, who he recognized the Republic of Hawaii, President Cleveland did, but then he refused to annex it. And he did that against the hopes of the actual imperialists in the Republican Party, such as Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Teddy Roosevelt, Elihu Root, and John Hay. John Hay is a particularly disappointing example because Hay and Nikolai are famous as Lincoln's boys. They grew up in politics serving Lincoln, and John Hay turned around and became one of the most rabidly imperialist Anglophiles in the country and in McKinley's cabinet, and was one of the people most responsible for the rapprochement between America and England during this time, especially in terms of naval warfare, helping each other out and beginning what's now called the special relationship between the US and the UK. John Hay would be McKinley's ambassador to the UK, and then after the Secretary of State. This whole group would often gather at the home of John Hay and Hay's neighbor, Henry Adams. Henry Adams was one of the two fallen grandsons of John Quincy Adams, along with his brother Brooks Adams. Henry Adams taught Senator Henry Cabot Lodge at Harvard and remained a lifelong friend of his, along with others in this group like Alfred Thayer Mahan and the British ambassador Cecil Spring Rice, who was Teddy Roosevelt, one of Teddy Roosevelt's best friends. This grouping was informally known as the Friendly Gang. And as I said, they would all meet often in the Washington, D.C. homes of Hay and Adams. And they shared common beliefs. They believed in expanding American territorial acquisitions. They believed in the necessary expansion of American naval power that would facilitate it. They were early and vocal advocates for the necessity of a canal across Central America that would allow the easier passage of US naval forces between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And in the years leading up to the McKinley administration, they turned their attention to Cuba, the plight of its brave rebels yearning for self-determination. And in many ways, the war drive was the result of this group organizing, which was led by Henry Cabot Lodge, Teddy Roosevelt. Henry Cabot Lodge was actually the political benefactor of Teddy Roosevelt his entire life. Pretty much every political appointment Teddy Roosevelt ever got was due to the influence of Henry Cabot Lodge. Teddy Roosevelt considered Henry Cabot Lodge one of his best friends, along with Cecil Spring Rice. Henry Cabot Lodge was the scion of two old Anglophile Boston Brahmin families, the Cabots and the Lodges. And this group's message was also boosted daily in the press by the yellow, what became termed the yellow press of people like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. These were both Democrats. They supported McKinley's opponent, William Jennings Bryan, these fanatical imperialists. They attacked McKinley relentlessly in their papers, these actual fanatical imperialists. So the backstory on Henry Cabot Lodge, he was the grandson of George Cabot, who chaired the treasonous Hartford Convention in 1814, advocating for the dissolution of the Union. Here we see a comic at the time about the Hartford Convention with Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, all wondering if they should jump off of this into the arms of George III. And a lot of the Cabot family fortune was made by a man named Samuel Cabot, who partnered with arguably one of the worst Americans in history, his Boston Brahmin father-in-law, Thomas Handesid Perkins. And they gained their wealth through looting vast sums of money in the trade of slaves and opium. And Henry Cabot Lodge got his political education from his teacher, Henry Adams. And Henry Cabot Lodge married the sister-in-law of Brooks Adams. So very, very close ties between Lodge and the Adamses. And Lodge and this entire grouping, they believed in race science and the supremacy of what they termed Anglo-Saxon civilization. Henry Cabot Lodge wrote his dissertation titled The Anglo-Saxon Land Law, which was supervised by Henry Adams. And they wrote this book collaboratively, Essays in Anglo-Saxon Law, which was published in 1876. Matt, as you know, Magdalena Terrien did a fantastic deep dive into this Anglo-Saxonism for Rising Tide Foundation a few months back. And in my article, there's a link to that presentation, which everybody should know because there was so much about Anglo-Saxonism I was not aware of that just, made for a much richer canvas. it's interesting that these Anglo-Saxonists didn't actually venerate life in England. They considered England to be as depraved and fallen of a society as America was. And just like the later Nazis and their Tula society, they venerated this mythic Aryan civilization of the past that never actually existed, but that they built up this whole mythos around. They're extreme nihilists. They saw nothing in modern America except moral and spiritual decay. They romanticized life in the early 1800s before technology started changing people's lives. The irony that in the early 1800s, people's lives had been greatly improved over people's lives in the early 1700s through technology was completely lost on them. They were just unable to keep up with the latest science and all the developments in society. And to them, life was just this endless series of events evincing the decay of the idyllic Anglo-Saxon social fabric. And the chief among these were the Jew bankers in New York and London. Here's just a selection of quotes from Henry Adams, which I'll just let the readers, the viewers, pause and read to.
No, go ahead and read them.
No, I think you should
okay.
let the readers read it. It's too disgusting. Just let the readers see it. They can see it.
I agree. Yeah. It is disgusting. And I was also worried YouTube tends to.
YouTube might do the thing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. All right. This is Henry Adams' view. This is Hitler's view. And this is Teddy Roosevelt's view. So go ahead and just let the readers look at it.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. So in response to this perceived threat to Anglo-Saxon civilization, these men found hope only in the promise of war as an instrument of national rejuvenation. And they took the
Why don't you take that off the screen now that you're finished with it? All right?
Yes, absolutely.
Prevent lying censorship of it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, they turned towards the plight of the Cuban rebels. Which, to be fair, I mean, the plight was real of the Cuban rebels, and a lot of Americans were sympathetic to it. And so this attitude amongst the American population could be manipulated to drive the nation needlessly into a war these men deemed necessary in order to revive this mythic Anglo-Saxonism of theirs. So Lodge, as I said, he was the architect of Teddy Roosevelt's political career. Roosevelt worshipped at the altar of Anglo-Saxon naval hegemony, influenced by both his love of Alfred Thayer Mahan, one of the men involved in this group who often met at the Hay and Adams houses, and also Teddy Roosevelt's uncle, James Dunwoody Bullock. He was a leader of the Confederate Secret Service during the U.S. Civil War. He helped procure vast amounts of weapons, ships, and hard currency for the Confederacy, working out of England, not even working out of the South. He was that much Anglo-Saxon, you could say. Indeed, Bullock was so important that after the war, he was not included in the general amnesty for the Confederate soldiers because of his high-level involvement in the Confederate Secret Service, and he had to remain in England. Teddy Roosevelt actually traveled to England to meet his most favorite uncle and learn naval tactics and strategy. Teddy Roosevelt writes to Henry Cabot Lodge, "I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." So in 1896, the president was Grover Cleveland, and the Republicans were trying to choose a nominee. This grouping opposed McKinley's nomination. They ran, in fact, Henry Cabot Lodge ran personally the campaign of McKinley's opponent, who was the Speaker of the House, Thomas Brackett Reed. He was a good man. He wasn't a great campaigner. He did very, very poorly, and McKinley was nominated easily. But in February 1896, Lodge actually wrote to Teddy Roosevelt that it will be a great misfortune to have McKinley nominated. And later in life, when Lodge published his correspondence, he deleted that passage. And despite their hatred for the Jew bankers that are supposedly destroying the Republic, Lodge was at the forefront of the Republican delegation at the convention in favor of keeping the US on the gold standard, controlled internationally by London bankers. He approached McKinley's campaign manager, Mark Hanna, at the convention and told him, "Mr. Hanna, I insist upon a positive declaration for a gold standard plank in the platform." Hanna replied, "Who in hell are you?" "Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts," he replied. "Well, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, you can plumb go to hell. You have nothing to say about it." However, Hanna learned that Lodge did have much to say about it, and the gold standard plank was included in the platform, although they did leave the door open for the free coinage of silver. So McKinley's nominated. Lodge rushes to Canton, Ohio, which is where McKinley's running his campaign from. The one thing he wants to ask the president is, can you please put Teddy Roosevelt in as Assistant Secretary of the Navy? McKinley tells him he's thinking about it, but displaying a pretty good understanding of who Roosevelt was, says, "I hope he has no preconceived plans which he would wish to drive through the moment he got in." Another supporter, Bellamy Storer, who became U.S. ambassador to Belgium and Spain under McKinley, he was also good friends with Teddy Roosevelt, also lobbied for him. And his wife asked him to please give him a chance to prove he can be peaceful. And McKinley said, "I'm afraid he's too pugnacious. I want peace. And I'm told that your friend Theodore is always getting into rows with everybody." So after McKinley's victory, Roosevelt writes to his older sister, Bammy, "The victorious Republican leaders have taken to feasting themselves, and especially Mark Hanna, and I have been to several Capuan entertainments. One was a huge lunch by the Seligmans, where at least half of the guests were bankers. I felt as if I was personally realizing all of Brooks Adams' gloomiest anticipations of our gold-ridden, capitalist-bestridden, usurer-mastered future." Right before he takes office, he meets with Grover Cleveland, who's the departing president, and the talk kept coming back to Cuba. As Cleveland put it, McKinley adverted to the horrors of war and was intensely saddened by the prospect incident to the loss of life. At the end of the meeting, McKinley rose to go and said, "Mr. President, if I can go out of office at the end of my term with the knowledge that I have done what lay in my power to avert this terrible calamity, with the success that has crowned your patience, I shall be the happiest man in the world." And Cleveland added that no man ever gave me a stronger idea of his unyielding determination to do his duty when thus confronted by a great crisis. Here we see a letter written to Henry Cabot Lodge. "I have not met a man in the aristocratic upper crust in which you and I are embedded who considers that we have any justifiable cause for war. Below that crust, the wish for war is almost universal." So it may seem paradoxical through a modern lens today, but the major commercial and industrial interests in the country were generally opposed to war. They had just gone through the Panic of 1893, which was one of the worst in American history, and they all rallied around McKinley, who was promising a return to prosperity through peace, tariffs, internal improvements, not war. They thought war would only encourage instability and jeopardize a recovery. Teddy Roosevelt, during this period, says, "I am a quietly rampant Cuba Libre man. I doubt whether the Cubans would do very well in the line of self-government, but anything would be better than the continuance of Spanish rule. Send our fleet promptly to Havana." So as we can see, the conversation between McKinley and Grover Cleveland shows Cuba Libre, this was an issue even before McKinley took office. This Adams-Hay faction wanted this war over Cuba. It was part of their overarching worldview. America was becoming too soft. War would restore national vigor. McKinley was under tremendous pressure from the outset, from this faction of his own party, as well as the Democratic yellow press of Pulitzer and Hearst. This was a bipartisan push for war, the war propaganda handled by Pulitzer and Hearst. McKinley, he was adamant that war must be avoided, and he tried everything he could think to do. And his failure to declare war was weaponized by this faction, that this was destructive to the national honor. Only war could repair the damage done. And this kind of war demagoguery began to take over the national mind. For ambassador to Spain, McKinley appoints Stuart Woodford, who is somebody who was generally regarded as straightforward and honest. And his instructions from McKinley were to do everything he could to keep the peace and avoid war. Again, displaying McKinley's fanatical imperialism, right? McKinley offered to resolve the issue by buying Cuba. He said we could make it a protectorate or a new state. Spain refused. He refused to recognize the rebels as belligerents, saying that that would be tantamount to intervention, which a lot of people were encouraging him to do. In August 1897, Spain's prime minister is assassinated by an anarchist, surprise, surprise, who was operating out of London. Spain had this system called the turno, so the government alternated between liberals and conservatives. So a new Spanish liberal government came in on October 4th, 1897. And McKinley hoped that this would be a chance to make new progress with this new government. He hoped that the new liberal government would, that dealing with them would be more fruitful. Spain promised McKinley they would give Cuba, quote unquote, autonomy, but it would still be controlled by the mother country. There was a governor general who was very vicious and hated, named Weyler. He had been sent there to suppress the rebels, and Spain promised that they would recall him. So McKinley and Woodford, they both see this as a breakthrough and a first step, and they start pushing for more. They pointed out there was still a lot of atrocities going on. This kind of made Spain bristle at all these demands being made on them. And another person, sorry, one sec. Yeah. No, I'll get to that in a second. So McKinley had a lot of help in Congress as well. Thomas Brackett Reed, Speaker of the House, Mark Hanna, Nelson Aldrich. They were very powerful in Congress, and all of them wanted to avoid war. So these were his closest allies in Congress. At the close of the year 1897, McKinley in his annual message says, "There's no desire on the part of our people to profit by the misfortunes of Spain. We have only the desire to see the Cubans prosperous and contented, enjoying that measure of self-control which is the inalienable right of man. I speak not of forcible annexation, for that cannot be thought of. That, by our code of morality, would be criminal aggression." So in Havana, McKinley inherited this man, Fitzhugh Lee. He was the nephew of Robert E. Lee. He was a brigadier general for the Confederacy, as well as the 40th governor of Virginia. And he was another source of pressure on McKinley, constantly pushing intervention during this time. And after McKinley's annual message to Congress, Fitzhugh Lee was furious about it. He saw it as totally weak and heartless, dragging his feet on Cuba as we go into the new year, 1898. Almost right away, second week of January, they start getting reports of these anti-American riots in Cuba. And it was the first of a series. Eventually, it was shown that it was kind of exaggerated, but it was the first of a series of events that ultimately completely flanked McKinley and his push for peace. And it just destroyed Americans' faith in Spain's ability to control Cuba and reform Cuba. So McKinley, after the riots, he didn't make any outward declaration of any change in stance because he didn't want to make it seem that war was becoming more and more inevitable. He wanted to keep the options for peace open as long as he could. The Cuban rebels began insisting that only independence would suffice. They kept asking for America to intervene on their behalf. So the rebels were asking for American help. So that was very powerful propaganda as well. This is Spain's ambassador to the US, Enrique Dupuy de Lôme. He wrote back that he thinks that McKinley is becoming more and more impressed with the reports of Fitzhugh Lee, and de Lôme privately, he did not have any faith in the autonomy scheme for Cuba and was worried that McKinley, he's losing faith in Spain and their ability to implement autonomy in Cuba, and that if things didn't change soon, one small thing could set off a confrontation between the two countries. Woodford met with the Queen Regent next in Madrid. Her name was Maria Cristina of Austria. And he left thinking that she was basically powerless, which did not help. He did not believe that the Queen Regent and Spain in general had the power to resolve this situation. And it was at this moment that a private letter from de Lôme back to Spain was intercepted by Cuban rebels in New York City and passed on to William Randolph Hearst, and was published in Hearst paper February 9th, 1898. Huge headline across the front page: the worst insult to the United States in its history. The letter called McKinley weak. He was only interested in admiration from crowds. He was a would-be politician who tries to leave a door open behind himself while keeping on good terms with the jingos of his party. It seems de Lôme was tipped off about the letter being intercepted. He resigned one day before it was printed publicly. And McKinley, he said, this resignation would not be enough. If there's any hope of assuaging the outrage among Americans, there will have to be an official apology from Spain. A few days later, an apology did come from Spain. It seemed a little bit insincere. However, McKinley hoped that this would put the whole thing to rest. Unfortunately, a few days later, another huge bomb would go off in the midst of all this. Here's a quote. This was around this time of a friend of his, Herman Kohlstadt, in a private memoir he wrote of seeing McKinley at a White House function around this time. McKinley met him in a private room. He rested his head on his hands, complained of not sleeping, and complained that Congress is trying to drive him into a war with Spain. He broke down and cried like a boy of 13. So I think this shows like how much this whole thing negatively was influencing McKinley and his mental state. And right around this time, a massive explosion rips through the USS Maine, which is parked in Havana. McKinley had seen the sending of the USS Maine to Havana as a friendly gesture, and he insisted that Spain was welcome to park one of its battleships in New York City or any other eastern port, showing that the two nations were friendly and not at war. And the Maine arrived and sat in Havana Harbor for about 2 weeks. People would come and check out the gleaming battleship. Soldiers were greeted and they fraternized with the townspeople. And every day went by without incident until the night of February 14th gave way to the early hours of February 15th. A massive explosion ripped through the ship's hull. And of the 355 men on the crew, 261 were killed by the explosion and subsequent sinking. McKinley was awoken at 3 a.m. by a watchman who had Navy Secretary Long on the telephone. His old friend Nelson Dingley met with him a few hours later and remarked he had never seen McKinley so worried. His mind reeling from the bad news, McKinley just kept saying one thing: there must be no war. Navy Secretary Long also met with him a few days later, February 17th, and said he was also very concerned about his state. McKinley said, "I have been through one war. I have seen the dead piled up, and I do not want to see another war." So even after all this, where he would have every excuse to say, yes, let's go to war, he still insisted, we're not going to war. I will do everything I can to avoid war. But McKinley says the Lôme incident, the destruction of the Maine, have added much to the popular feeling upon this subject, meaning Cuba. Although the better sentiment seems to be awaiting the report of the facts and to follow the action of the president after the Naval Board has made its report. Whatever that report may be, it by no means relieves the situation of its difficulties. The policy of starvation, the failure of Spain to take effective measures to suppress the insurrection, the loss of our commerce, the great expense of patrolling our coast, these things, intensified by the insulting and insincere character of the Lôme letter, all combine to create a condition that is very grave and which will require the highest wisdom and greatest prudence on both sides to avoid a crisis. At this time, a few weeks later, March 17th, Senator Redfield Proctor of Vermont stands up and gives a pretty dispassionate speech, just flatly laying out what I saw during my recent tour of Cuba. And this speech galvanized public opinion. He said, in Cuba, Spain has very little credibility among the populace. The rebels would never accept autonomy. American intervention in Cuba seemed inevitable now. The Senate was completely stunned by this report. And even and the commercial papers reported that even the business groups, which had been McKinley's stronghold of support, they were slowly starting to slip into the interventionist camp. Here we see a headline about Mark Hanna, who's now a senator. He was McKinley's campaign manager, then became a senator. Hanna says, "No war, but will the people accept the dictum of President McKinley's boss?" Around this time, Teddy Roosevelt sees Mark Hanna at the annual Gridiron Dinner in late March, and he shakes his fist under the nose of Mark Hanna and says, "We will have this war for the freedom of Cuba in spite of the timidity of the commercial interests."
Yeah. I'm just going to chime in very quickly, Sam, just because this already, I think, does a great job at destroying the idea that McKinley was this arch imperialist, because he had so many opportunities, if that was true, to go and just jump into the empire mode at all of these points of decision. And at every chance, he always fought against those who wanted the war. And so I think that already just shows his heart. And the second question is, what the Maine itself, was that like, I've heard it said that there's evidence that that was sort of like the first false flag incident in the United States. Do you think that that's true, or?
So at the time, one of the theories, which I guess I would say impresses me the most, so Captain Sigsbee, and actually Fitzhugh Lee as well, who was pretty interventionist, they both thought at first that it was an accident. They didn't believe that it was sabotage. And their theory was that the Navy had recently switched from anthracite coal to bituminous coal. And bituminous coal is much more volatile than anthracite coal. And they hypothesized that it had somehow ignited the ammunition stocks that were in the bow portion of the ship, because that's where the explosion took place. So there's been several studies of the USS Maine. So there were two reports at the time. One was a Spanish report. The Spain concluded that it was an accident, but that report carried absolutely no weight among the American population. They thought it was a completely fake report. And the American report concluded that it was an external explosion of unknown origin. Subsequent studies that were done in the late 1900s by the Navy again supported the idea that it was an accident, that it was an internal explosion. So there's competing theories.
Okay. All right, cool. And I know that Anton's time is somewhat limited, so yeah, I'm assuming that you're going to be able to get to
the end here. Yeah, I'm getting to the end. Right. So I'll just put this up. This was after the report came out saying that it was an external explosion, that was like the floodgates were open. It's time to go to war with Spain. McKinley now has one more chance. He cables his final peace plan to Woodford, which says there must be an immediate armistice, an end to the reconcentration, which is like concentration camp. They were taking rebels and concentrating them in other areas. If peace terms between Spain and the rebels were not reached by October 1st, McKinley would arbitrate a binding solution to the problem. And McKinley would approach the Cuban rebels directly for their participation if Spain first agreed. Spain had rejected similar proposals to this since 1895, so the chances of success were not great. And the Spanish reply was somewhat yes, somewhat no. So it was not encouraging at all. McKinley felt now he was out of time. The pressure on him was enormous. And he very reluctantly started composing the war message that he had to send to Congress. There was one hope that came on April 9th, which is, his Spanish ambassador, Woodford, the U.S. ambassador to Spain, Woodford, cables home that the Queen Regent met with the Pope, and it was for Easter. And the Pope had made a request to please avoid war. And so the Queen now says she will proclaim unconditional suspension of hostilities and take steps to implement autonomy. So it seemed like McKinley was finally getting what he wanted. And he consulted with a lot of his friends. He had a friend, West Virginia Senator Stephen Benton Elkins, who was one of McKinley's most staunchest pro-peace supporters. And even he said, I think this comes too late. I think if this had come just a few days ago, we might have been able to avert war. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge also agreed that it was too late. And just in general, Americans had zero faith in Spain's ability to implement any kind of autonomy or peace plan. And because of the relentless headlines in the yellow press, the American public was almost rabidly like frothing at the mouth for war with Spain. It was kind of seen in that earlier quote about the upper crust and then the lower crust, saying like universally amongst the lower crust, the desire for war is universal. And eventually McKinley he caved to the pressure. You know, maybe you can criticize him for that. I think it's legitimate, but I think that also to call him fanatically imperialist is just demonstrably wrong. A note arrived from McKinley during this time from an old man who knew Abraham Lincoln while he was alive. And he said, yours is a strange fate indeed. No man in all the land exists more averse to war than yourself. When you were elected president, you did not dream of war as a possibility. And when the possibility presented itself, no man strove harder to avert it. So here's just a couple more quotes about Teddy Roosevelt, and then I'll be done. Teddy Roosevelt wrote to Hermann Speck von Sternberg, the German military attaché in Washington, January 1898, so the war had not started yet. Between ourselves, I have been hoping and working ardently to bring about our interference in Cuba. If we could get the 7 Spanish ironclads together against our 7 seagoing ironclads on this coast, we would have a very pretty fight. And I think more could be learned from it. I am glad Mahan is having such influence with your people, but I wish he had more influence with his own. It is very difficult to make this nation wake up. Here is the order when the Naval Secretary Long took a day off in February. Roosevelt in one day completely reoriented the U.S. Naval Department towards war, sending ships all over the globe, buying huge stocks of coal, and he sent this cable to Commander Dewey of the Asian Squadron, Commander Dewey, a man that Roosevelt himself put in place the year earlier. He said, order the squadron to Hong Kong, keep full of coal. In the event of declaration of war with Spain, your duty will be to see that the Spanish squadron does not leave the Asiatic coast, and then offensive operations in the Philippine Islands. And this was completely contrary to what McKinley wanted. Secretary Long, coming in and seeing what Roosevelt had done, wrote in his diary, Roosevelt has gone at things like a bull in a china shop. The very devil seemed to possess him yesterday afternoon. I really think he is hardly fit to be entrusted with the responsibility of the department at this critical time. Unfortunately, most unfortunately, Long, perhaps not wanting to appear weak, he did not overturn the work that Roosevelt had done. And so the war footing in the Naval Department remained. This was something that McKinley's friend Kolstadt remembered. He said the president, saying in the years after, talking about the Philippines, showing just how little McKinley knew about the Philippines, he could not have located those islands within 2,000 miles before Dewey's victory. And he said, since McKinley had authorized an expedition to the islands, this story, like so much of Mr. Kolstadt's memory, seems apocryphal. Perhaps McKinley, there was people working to undermine what McKinley actually wanted. But he said, he could also say with greater certainty, McKinley also said, if old Dewey had just sailed away when he smashed that Spanish fleet, what a lot of trouble he would have saved us. And the issue of the Philippines, he never wanted the Philippines. McKinley said he had no idea what to do with them. And he told a group of Methodist clergymen, I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight. And I'm not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went right down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And he said he came to an epiphany one night. Giving back the islands to Spain would be cowardly and dishonorable. Giving them to France or Germany would be bad business. The islands could not be left alone. They were unfit for self-government. So there was nothing left to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos, uplift and Christianize them. And this is the main piece of evidence always given to why McKinley was a fanatic imperialist, because he didn't believe that the Filipinos were ready for self-government and he wanted to uplift and Christianize them. I think a lot of what he's arguing here is correct. You don't want Spain to take it back. You don't want France or Germany to get it. You don't want Japan to get it, who was a rising power at the time. Whether or not they were fit for self-government, I won't comment on. But it just shows how little he knew about the Philippines. He didn't know that they had long since been converted to Catholicism by the Spanish. He's saying that we have to Christianize them. That's how little he knew about the Philippines. So in closing, let's just compare a statement from Roosevelt and a statement from McKinley and see who are the fanatical imperialists and who are the war lovers. Roosevelt said in a famous speech he gave at the U.S. Naval War College, June 2nd, 1897, all the great masterful races have been fighting races. And the minute that a race loses its hard fighting virtues, then it has lost its proud right to stand as the equal of the best. No triumph of peace is quite so great as the supreme triumphs of war. No triumph of peace is quite so great as the supreme triumphs of war. Now compare that to McKinley's inaugural address. Peace is preferable to war in almost every contingency.
All right. Thank you, Sam Labrier. That was an incredible exposition and an essential bit of history that people need to internalize fast if we are going to avoid the storms and calamities of the misuse of history of a lot of dishonest agents who are trying to repeat the worst elements of our past in the present circumstance. We are, after all, I should just point this out, in a position where we've suffered from a number of false flag incidents, from the Gulf of Tonkin incident that got us into the Vietnam War, as well as 9/11 itself, which I think most people watching by this point, if they're watching this video, you probably have discovered that that was also an inside job that was induced to turn the tide of popular opinion towards becoming in favor of a war that never should have happened, which destroyed the lives of millions of people, both Americans and especially Arabs around the world, and destroyed nations that should be standing strong today. And that even now we see war games, military exercises on China's perimeter with assets that the US military industrial complex has kept a hold of in Philippines, in Guam, which again should not have military bases, but yet despite that have remained as military colonies and are being used as beachheads for an oncoming supposed necessary war with big bad China that we are being led to believe we have to support as citizens. So again, this history is so important. The misuse of McKinley's tariff, the misuse of McKinley's foreign policy to justify expansionism, and especially the eugenics revivalism that has emerged around the transhumanist clique, of which we see no shortage in Silicon Valley that have attempted to take control over things like policies around AI, the Iron Dome, other things. That is a direct continuity to this Teutonic Aryan mythos that was part of the eugenics pseudoscience garbage of a century ago. And people I'm really happy that you did this, because these are ideas that need to be internalized. Now, due to some technical issues, technical glitches on Anton's side, we decided that what we're going to do is a two-parter. And in a couple of days' time, I'm going to talk to Anton Chaikin, who will do a follow-up presentation that will, I think, complement what you just did very nicely. And that'll add to the coloring of the misuse of McKinley's name and the American system's name in a few days. So for everybody, go to the description box under this video, subscribe to Sam's Substack, follow his work, watch the last class that he gave. It's an essential class on the real American system and protectionism. That'll be all in the description box, and stay tuned for the next video of the Canadian Patriot podcast. Thank you for joining.